Welcome to Kitchen Woodworking Projects. In my 50 years of woodworking, I've always preferred to make useful projects rather than just make something because I want to make it and they go, okay, now what do I do with it? I either want to be able to use it here in the workshop, or we can use it in the home, or even I can give it as a gift, just as long as it's useful. And one of the great places to make projects for is the kitchen. So today we're going to take a look at 3 woodworking projects and how to do them. I've got a single wine bottle holder, and this is something you might put on the table or on the sideboard when you're doing a fancy dinner and you want to show off your wine. Maybe you've got an expensive bottle of wine or something. I've got a little cheese board. This is kind of like a cutting board, except it's really designed, it's the size for a small wheel cheese or maybe a cheese ball that you can have crackers with or something like that. And then a triple wine rack where you could go either on the sideboard or behind the bar for displaying some nice bottles of wine. These are all fairly simple projects, but there's ways you can embellish them. And in the process of showing you how to make these, I'm going to give you a lot of tips and tricks on how to make your woodworking better, and how to make it either fancy or how to make it easier or how to make it stronger. So let's get into it and let's see what we can do with these 3 projects. Today we're going to build a little wine rack. Now this isn't the kind of wine rack you'd put, say, in your bar where you put all the bottles. This is just a 1-bottle wine rack. This is the type of thing you use if you want to impress your guests. You're going to serve wine for dinner. Instead of just setting the bottle there on the table, you put it in a rack to display it nicely. That's what it's for. Not a real complex project, but does pose us a couple of challenges, which gives us an opportunity to practice our woodworking skills. So I need one piece that's 12 inches long and I need one piece that's 6 inches long. But that 6-inch long, remember that's the one that's got the hole in the edge. So I'll actually cut that 8 inches long, and then after we put the hole in it, I'm going to cut it down to 6. I've got 3 different options available to me to make the hole in this piece: the Forstner bit, a spade bit, or a hole saw. The Forstner bit gave me a pretty clean cut, even when I was going cross grain. I have to say this particular bit, I know for a fact, has been on the dull side, okay? The spade bit was really giving me a really smooth cut, looked beautiful, until I pulled out. And then the blade caught on the side of the hole, and that's where all this mess comes from. And then the hole saw looked like it was going to be pretty good, but we got a lot of burn there and a lot of chipping down on the bottom. And there's a lot of lines going through here. Now they all have the lines, but this has got the worst. So based on this, I've decided I'm going to go with the Forstner bit. So after making my hole, I've gone ahead and cut it off on the radial arm saw, or you could use a table saw, you could use a circular saw, whatever saw you've got. And I ended up with my half circle cutout that they're calling for in the plans. The next thing they say is to round these corners on here and on the other piece with a 1/2 inch radius. Had I decided to cut that on the scroll saw, I still would have had to come over here to the belt sander to smooth it out afterwards. So what I really just did is save myself some time. With our parts cut out, the next thing that the instructions suggest, and it's a suggestion, it's not a requirement, is to round all the edges. I like that on any piece because I think it looks good, but it's especially good in pine because pine has a tendency to chip. So we're going to go ahead and round the edges just 1/8 of an inch to make sure that we get rid of those chips. And it's time for a little sanding. Here we come to a place where I'm a bit at odds with the plans. And the reason is this. The plans call for the 2 pieces to be attached together with screws, okay, at a right angle. Well, that doesn't sound too bad. Here's where the problem is, though. Those screws are going to go into the end grain of this piece of wood. Now, granted, this is not a great, structural monstrosity here. It's under a lot of stress and going to have a lot of weight on it. It's going to have a bottle of wine on it. Okay, but what happens if somebody drops it and say it lands on that corner right there? Now we've got a lot of stress on this joint and on those screws. Now screws, when they go into end grain, cut the wood fibers, as you can see in this picture. And because they cut the wood fibers, there's really not a whole lot of strength there. And that drop can cause those screws to come loose. So what I want to do is put it together with dowel pins, okay? Now I love using dowel pins, and a lot of people are afraid to use dowel pins because, oh, you need a doweling jig and whatever. I'm going to do it without a doweling jig. I'm going to use a drill and a drill bit and some clamps and a block of wood. Now anytime you're putting 2 pieces of wood together at an angle, you need to clamp it. So I'm just going to take a piece of 2x2 here and I'll use that as a guide block. I've drawn a line on this side of the wood, and over here I've marked where my holes are going to be, okay? So this line is only here, so I know where to put these clamps. So now I'm going to take another pair of clamps and I'll use this pair of clamps to clamp my other piece to that Same 2x2, okay? Yeah, I know it looks like a mess here with all these clamps, but what I've got is I now have it all securely clamped together, and I have access to my location for my holes on this side. So let's go ahead and drill those holes. And you know, one of the nice things about doing this way is that if I'm a touch off on my holes, if they're not absolutely straight, it's still gonna work. Now, I could just go ahead and put the dowel pins in right now, but the problem with that is that I won't have glued the two pieces together. The only glue will be on the dowel pins, and I don't particularly like that idea. So I've taken it back apart, and we're gonna put some glue on there. Now, I'm only putting glue on one surface here. I'm not gonna put it on both surfaces, partially because I probably can't do it accurately enough on that other surface. Whoops, 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 whoops. Yeah, I slip sometimes. Drive those in, and then I'm going to clamp it this way and let the glue dry. I think I said on one of these videos that I always make a mistake on the project. Well, I did on this one too. I forgot to put glue on my dowel pins. So I just had to take it all apart, put the glue on the dowel pins, and put it all back together. Now it's clamped up, and we're waiting for the glue to dry. Now that the glue's had time to set, all we got to do is take the clamps off and cut off the remaining stubs from the dowels. You need a flush cut saw from this, and this little DeWalt is my favorite flush cut saw. I've got others, but this thing's wonderful. The blade is flexible, and it does a great job. And then it'd be a good idea to hit that with a sander. And there we go. There's our wine stand. Now, where did I put that bottle? We're going to build ourselves a wine rack. So this particular one will hold 3 bottles. It's actually made of 2x6s. You know, it's amazing what you can make 2x6s look like if you do it right. So let's get started and make some sawdust and get ourselves a wine rack. So here's my 2 boards that I bought at the lumber yard. As per usual, this is construction grade lumber. They've got knot holes, and actually these are pretty clean for construction grade lumber. I don't have any wane. I don't have any of the bark edge here, okay, to deal with, but I do have knot holes, which I really don't want in my finished piece. Here on this edge, I can feel where they did the round over the corners, and the bit cut a little bit into it, so I've got to deal with that. And of course the corners around it. Now if you buy 1x lumber, you got sharp corners. If you buy 2x lumber, you're going to end up with rounded corners, about 1/8 of an inch rounding. And you can say, oh, no big deal, we just have that. Well, okay, but where the 2 pieces of the frame come together, what we're going to end up with is a little round over. It's not going to line up neatly. So that's really not good. So I'm going to have to modify my design a little bit by adjusting my lumber. What I'm going to do is I'm going to trim the 2 outside edges, and then I also need to plane it a little bit because there's a little bit of cupping to these boards, and I need to get rid of that cupping. So here's what I got to do. I've got to select which parts of this lumber I'm going to use and cut my pieces. Now I'll have to cut them too long because when I run them through the planer, there's a high probability of a little bit of snipe at the end. So I'll cut them too long so I can then later cut them down. And then I'm going to run them through the table saw, or I'll cut them to that length, and I'll run them through the table saw and square up the edges, and then run them through the planer to get rid of the cupping. Once I've done all that, then I can go back and cut them to the right length. So that's a lot of extra steps there that are necessary because we're using construction grade lumber. The design calls for putting this together with pocket hole screws, which is a great way to assemble something like this, especially if we can keep the screws hidden. Now, in this particular case, we'll be plugging the holes, so keeping it hidden isn't quite as important. Nevertheless, you know, the more we can keep it hidden, the better off we are. I've gone ahead and marked the center line of my top and bottom because that's the piece the screws are going to be going through, and that's the pieces I've got to drill. It isn't absolutely essential that the screws be centered, but it's just more attractive. It's just doing things the right way, you might say, okay? I've set up my jig for 1.5 inch thick material, and I've set my drill bit for that, so time to drill some holes. If you'd like a little more detailed explanation about working with pocket hole screws, I recommend that you take a look at the video on the clamp holder, the wall clamp holder that we've done, because there I give a pretty good explanation of how to work with these screws. I've gone ahead and set up my drill in a drill guide attachment. This is a great option for people who don't have a drill press. We need our holes to be really straight here, otherwise we're going to have a real hard time with the dowels. We might get them to go in, but then they'll bow or something, and they won't provide a good support for the wind bottle. The other nice thing this does for us is it's got a built-in drill stop right here, so I can make sure I get my depth of cut right. Now, if you don't have that, you can put a flag on your drill bit with a piece of tape, but this works a lot better. By the way, because I trim my material down, remember I was cutting those curved edges off, I had to readjust my dimensions. Now, my overall board width, instead of being 5.5, is 5 3/8. So that means I've taken a 1/16 of an inch off each side. That in turn means that my hole dimension from the edge isn't 1 5/8, it's 1 9/16. So when you make adjustments like that, make sure you think it through and you don't miss out on things like, what else does that affect? After you cut off your dowel rods, take a piece of sandpaper and just run it around, because you're probably going to have some shavings sticking off the end there. And you want to get rid of those so they don't make it more difficult to get the dowel into the hole. You also want to check and make sure your dowel actually fits in your holes. Now mine fits really well, but dowels can vary in size, so you may find that your dowels are a little too wide for your holes. If that's the case, you either need to make your holes a little bit bigger, which might be hard to do unless you have something like metric drill bits that you could go from 500 thousandths up to 506 thousandths, or you're going to have to sand your dowel rods even more, just trying to bring them down so that they'll fit in those holes. Normally you would want them to be really tight, but I would say in this case, because of the challenge of assembling this many pieces at once, don't try and go for real tight. You're better off with it just a touch loose. Not too loose, because the glue doesn't do much gap filling, but just loose enough that you're not going to have to pound it together. And by the way, this is 3 dowel rods, so just because one piece fits correctly doesn't mean they're all going to fit correctly, okay? So try a few different ones and make sure you get something from each of the dowel rods that you've cut up. There's a thing in woodworking called dry fitting, and the idea is you put something together the way it's going to go together and clamp it up and do it all without the glue. You do that before you put the glue in, just to make sure everything's going to fit together properly. And this is a great project for that, because we've got so many pieces that have got to go together all at the same time. It's not like we can do part of it and then another part of it. We've actually got to put everything together all at the same glue up. So what I want to do is get my dowel rods in place. Here's my bottom piece. Now there's more space between the dowel rods and top because the bottle's got to fit there. So this is my bottom piece. Now I'm going to go ahead and set it in here. And I've got to spread my pieces out just enough to get it in there. And here's my top piece. And as you can see, just trying to get that top piece in place caused my dowels to pop out, which is what I can expect when I get around to doing it with the glue. Okay, so I can see that all my parts fit together the way they're supposed to. So now I can take it back apart, put the glue in there, and put it together. I'm not real happy with how my dry fit went together, mostly because it's just too many pieces to try and align at one time. So what I've decided to do is attach the top and bottom pieces to one of the sides first, then put the dowels in and put the other side on. That should at least lower the amount of pieces I have to line by 2, if nothing else, okay? To do this, I'm having to use a corner clamp because the clamp that came with my pocket hole jig, it's just not big enough to clamp that together. So I'm using a regular corner clamp. You could use whatever sort of corner clamp you want. Whenever I'm using my corner clamp, I put a couple spacer blocks under the piece to keep everything aligned so I don't build a twist into it, okay? The other thing I'm going to go ahead and do is I'm going to go ahead and glue the joint, even though in reality pocket holes or screws are strong enough to hold it together without glue. But on the other hand, in tests that have been run, it has been found that pocket holes used in conjunction with glue do form a stronger joint. I'm all for stronger joints. You never know what kind of abuse something is going to receive, even accidentally. Okay, so now I've got that glued and I've got it aligned. I'll go ahead and put some screws in. Okay, so now even with those 2 joints done, I've got a very limited work time here. I've got about 5 minutes to get all of this put together. So step one is put some glue on the dowels and put them in the holes. I need to glue both ends at the same time here. Okay, so now with glue on everything, I can go ahead and fit my other side piece in. This is where things start getting tricky. And I'm gonna work my way from the bottom end, which is near me, putting these dowels in. Now I'll align this corner and put the screws in, then flip it around and align the other corner and put those screws in. The other thing I've done a little bit different here is that on the bottom end, the end near me, the dowels are closer, so I've decided to go ahead and put the pocket screws in from the bottom, mostly because there's not enough room to fit the drill in there. I've still got a spacing problem here with the dowel rod. Okay, the other thing I've got a problem with is apparently I've got a little bit of twist here. So I'm going to go ahead and put a bar clamp on here and pull this in to straighten it out. Once it's in, the screw will hold it just fine, but I got to get it there in the first place. So now I can let that glue dry and then we can go ahead and plug those holes and finish her up. The last step in putting my wine rack together is plugging the holes from pocket screws. Now, I don't really have to worry about the ones in the bottom because that's going to sit on top of a countertop. If it was going to hang on the wall, which is one option for this, then I would need to plug those as well. But all I'm going to concern myself with is these on the inside of the top because they will be visible. The holes that we drill are 3/8 of an inch diameter, so 3/8 inch dowel rod works great for plugging them. You don't want to be stingy on the glue here. You don't want to be ridiculous either, but we're going into an angled hole, so we want to make sure that we get glue all the way around, okay? We'll end up cutting off some of that after it dries. I've got 3/8 inch dowel rods. These pieces are 2 inches long, which works out just about right. You can actually go just a shade shorter, but 2 inches is a good length. You just push them into the holes. Then we're going to leave that set, and then once it's set, we can cut it off with a flush trim saw. All right, so we'll leave that sit a couple hours and let that glue cure, and then cut it off. So now that our glue has had time to dry, all we've got to do is cut off these dowel rods with any flush cut saw, and then we want to take a sander and smooth that out. We'll sand this down smooth, and then once we finish it, you won't even be able to find that. Especially considering that that's going to be up on top like this, where people really aren't going to be looking. So here's our finished wine rack. Now, granted, I still need to stain it and varnish it, you know, but we've taken simple lumber. We've taken 2x6s, regular construction grade lumber, and turned it into something that once it's finished, once I get some stains and varnish on it, it's going to really look nice. It doesn't look like construction grade lumber, does it? You see, it's all about how you do it. It's all about how you treat the lumber. You're selective about your cuts. You get rid of the bad knot holes. You clean up the surfaces so you've got something nice, sand it well, and you know, you can make it look good. So, put our wine on there, set it by the table, and let our guests see that, yeah, we're a little more sophisticated than they thought we were. You know, one of the fun things about being a woodworker is being able to make gifts for people. You know, sometimes we need some motivation for our projects, and being able to make something that you're going to give to somebody kind of makes it a little more worthwhile. Well, I want to show you a project that's a great little gift. You know, it's kind of a classic woodworking project, and that's making a serving board or a cutting board, or some people call them charcuterie boards. These are kind of small, but the same idea applies even for something bigger. I've got 2 of them here, and this is a really simple project to do, but it impresses people. Now, one of the nice things about this project is you can embellish it, as I have with these, adding this walnut in. The original design's just all the same wood. Makes it a little more special, makes it a little more personalized, and when people receive a gift like this and they know you've made it, there's just something special about it. So let's get started. It's always a good idea to make these things out of hardwood rather than out of, say, you know, pine, softwood. If you're ever going to have to cut on one, you do with pine. Pine is soft, you end up scratching it up with a knife. Typically use hardwood. The picture here looks like this is, say, maple and maybe walnut. I went to my local lumber yard, and really they don't have a great selection of hardwoods. I bought a piece of oak, and this is what I'm going to make it out of, is oak. I like oak. I think oak is a beautiful wood. The grain really pops on it, and so we're going to make it out of oak. And the plan here comes with the picture here, but the main thing is we've got patterns, printable patterns for the 2 different styles. Okay, now this one's 4 3/4 by 10 inches, and this one's 6 inches by 9 3/4, okay? So if I want to cut this 6 inches out of one board, I've actually got to buy a 1x8. And a 1x8 oak 1x8 is going to be a little pricey. 4 3/4, that'd be a 1x6, but if I'm buying a 1x8, I could do it anyway. So when I bought my oak, you know, so this isn't any 6 inches wide. This is actually a 1x3, which means it's 2.5 inches wide. So if I put two pieces of this together, edge laminating it, I get 5 inches, and that's wide enough for the 4 3/4. And if I put three pieces together, it's 7.5 inches wide, and that's wide enough for the 6 inch one. And so that's what I'm going to do, edge gluing these pieces together and making it a little fancier. The plans really don't call for that, but they just say use a board. Well, a board can be an edge laminated board, and that's what I'm going to make it out. So I've gone ahead and cut up my board into lengths. These are 10.5 inches long, which is just a bit longer than what I need for it. And while I was at it, gosh, I found some walnuts sitting there in my stocks, and I just decided to go ahead and add some walnut in here. I really like using contrasting woods together because they just make the design pop. Makes it look, you know, takes it up another step, makes it look more expensive. And so I'm putting some walnut in here. Now, typically when you're edge gluing boards like this, you need to run the joining edges through a planer or plane them with a hand plane to make sure they're smooth and straight. And if I had cut these on a table saw, I would definitely need to do that. But because they came from the mill this way, they've already been finished. And so I've got a good clean surface to connect together. So I'm not worried about that. And I've already gone ahead and spread glue on the pieces and set them together. Now I need to clamp them. Now when you're putting glue on something like this, one of the things you want to do is make sure you spread the glue out. Don't just run that bead of glue down the middle and expect it to squeeze out. Yeah, it'll squeeze out, but it won't squeeze evenly. So you may not end up with what you want. And I'm going to go ahead and use 3 bar clamps. These are actually longer clamps than what I need, but I don't have the exact size I need. I'm just tightening it up a little bit, mostly because I don't want it to go cockeyed on me while I'm putting the other clamps in place. So we'll just tighten a little bit, and then we'll go back and tighten them up the rest of the way. Getting ready to run these boards through the planer just to smooth them out. Now, if you don't have a planer, you don't have to use a planer to do this. You can do it with a sander. Probably a belt sander or even a random orbital sander will do it. I'm using the planer because I have it available. But because they're so little, they really don't run through a planer well. So what I'm doing is I'm gluing them to a larger board, which means that they'll run through together as a pair. But the other thing that's going to do for me is that it's going to help, not only is it going to help get them leveled out, but it's going to help eliminate what's called snipe. Now, snipe is a place towards the end of your board as you're coming through the planer, if I'm going in this way, where you get more of a cut because of it coming off the wheels. Okay, there's some rollers in there that help make sure that your piece is pressed down against the table. All right, so what I'm doing here is I've got a couple pieces of scrap. This is actually some cut off from some trim. You can use literally anything for this, and I'm gluing them on here. Now these stick up just a touch higher than the highest point I've got here, so it's going to cut these first. But the other thing is, as I'm feeding through, when I get to the end, that area that would be sniped is right here. So I might get sniped in these, and I don't care, because when I get done, I'm throwing them away. These will come out of it good. And then because I'm using hot melt glue to hold it on, it can all come apart. And you can clean the hot melt glue off the base piece of wood, and it's ready to be used for something else. As I said, if you don't have a planer available to you, you can still smooth these out, get them leveled out with either a belt sander or a random orbital sander. The real key you want to watch out for when you do that is you don't want to leave the sander in one place. You want to keep it moving around as you're sanding so that you don't put any gouges in the surface, okay? I've got this up against a stop here on my bench, and we'll see how it goes. Now, even if I sand it with a belt sander, I want to go to finer sanders afterwards because that's going to leave the surface rather rough. So now that I've got a relatively smooth surface, I'll be doing more sanding later. I can go ahead and lay out my pieces, my patterns, I mean, on my pieces. So, and then trace them. You want to trace them, you want to get a good dark trace when you do this. I'm not sure how well my mechanical pencil is going to do here. You'd probably be better off with a regular pencil, nice and sharp, or even a fine point Sharpie marker, ballpoint pen. I mean, it really doesn't matter what you use. What matters is that you're able to see the line when you get done. And as far as my mark there in the middle, I'm just going to use my little center punch to transfer that. So this one is now ready to cut out. The best possible saw for cutting these boards out is a scroll saw. A scroll saw is generally a benchtop tool, or some people put them on a stand. It's designed for cutting tight curves, and that's what makes it so great for this. We have some curves that are fairly tight, and we need to get them cut as clean as possible. We can always sand them later to make it a little better, but we really want to get them as good as possible. If you don't have a scroll saw, another option is a bandsaw. Although a bandsaw is going to have a hard time with these tight curves, you're probably going to have to cut it like segmented and then sand it. Using a narrower blade on a bandsaw is beneficial. The other option is a jigsaw, which is a handheld electric tool. Jigsaws work. I'm not overly fond of them, and the main reason for that is because it's very, very easy when you're using a jigsaw to put sideways pressure on that blade and actually bend the blade. And not only does it ruin the blade, but you end up with a crooked cut. So you have to be careful using it, but they will work. And for years and years and years before I had a scroll saw, that's what I used, okay? Now, one of the things we want to make sure of is that we have the right blade in. Blades are measured in the number of teeth that are in the blade. And I realize this is probably not that visible on the camera, but this blade here has got about 20 teeth per inch, and this one's got about 10 teeth per inch. You want a minimum of 3 teeth for the material thickness. So if I hold this up to the side of my material here, I actually have about 5 or 6 teeth. That'll work good. Now, why would I want to use that instead of the finer tooth blade? Because what's going to happen with this finer tooth blade is that the teeth are going to get filled up with sawdust and the blade isn't going to cut as well. So a blade with larger teeth is going to actually cut through this material better than the smaller teeth. I've actually got a choice of a couple different sanders I could use to sand this now that I've cut it out. If I had inside curves, I'd be using an oscillating spindle sander, but because it's all outside curves, I'll go ahead and do it here on the belt sander. Our next step is to put the holes in these boards as shown on the pattern. This one gets a 1-inch hole and this one gets an 1.5-inch hole. And there's several different ways we can go about this. Probably the most common for most guys is to have a spade bit. Spade bits are good for holes up to inch, maybe 1.5 inches. The trick is avoiding tear out with them. Now, having them really sharp helps. The other thing that helps is don't drill all the way through. Go through most of the way from one side and then flip your workpiece over and finish the hole up from the other side. The same can be said for a hole saw. Now, good hole saws will do a decent hole for you. Again, you're going to get tear out on the backside if you try and cut it all the way through. The absolute best is to use a Forstner bit, and I've got Forstner bits both in 1 and 1.5 inch sizes, and this is probably the way I'm going to go because it's going to give me the cleanest hole. Forstner bits are designed for making flat bottom holes, but when you got to go through something, they're excellent for that as well. You can do this with a hand drill, but I prefer to do it with a drill press, simply because that makes sure that the bit is absolutely perpendicular to the workpiece. So all that's left before sanding and finishing is to round the edges. That's partially for appearance, partially to keep people from getting splinters. The reason we did the holes before doing the edges is so that we can do the same thing with the hole. So I've got an 1/8 of an inch round over bit chucked up in my trim router, and we'll just run that around the edges, and that will take care of routing the edges for us. So here we've got our 2 little boards ready to go. They still need a coat or 2 of varnish on them to seal them. Now, let me say this, okay? The instructions call for putting varnish on these, and I'm in agreement with that. But if you're going to use them for cutting boards, I wouldn't use varnish. Instead, I would oil them with just mineral oil. Mineral oil is food safe, and you don't have to worry about any slivers of wood oil coming off into the food. Varnish is considered food safe as well, but if you're using a knife with it and you end up cutting into the varnish, you could get slivers of it into the food. So that's something to avoid, okay? But you know, you can, as you can see, just a little bit of extra variety. We make these really beautiful. There's a lot of different ways you could go about this, but it's a fun little project. It's fairly easy, and now I've got a couple little gifts I can give to somebody. So why don't you go try making your own, and we'll see you next time.